Hey, we've got a hot take from the Supreme Court's decision in Jarkesy versus the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was a significant decision that was just handed out yesterday, and we're going to tell you why this decision is so important. But before we get into the holding that the Supreme Court recently made, let's set the stage about why this is important and what the issues were that they were actually fighting about. George Jarkesy on the one side and the Securities and Exchange Commission on the other side. Well, so for many of you, you know that with the fall of the Wall Street crash of 1929, several significant and important acts were passed by Congress. Importantly, the 1933 Securities Act, the Exchange Act of 1934, and then the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. All of those acts are significantly important in the way that people buy and sell securities and issues related to the sale of securities throughout the United States. Well, in 2010, Congress also passed the Dodd-Frank Act, which obviously enforced and gave additional remedies afforded to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So remember, the Securities and Exchange Commission is the enforcement arm. It's the arm of the government that has the right to regulate and to enforce violations of those acts that we just talked about. Well, they have the ability to go both into federal court when they're accusing somebody of violating one of these acts, and federal court, obviously, you have the ability to have a jury trial, right? They also have the ability to do the process internally through an administrative process where they have judges that are called administrative law judges. They are often employees of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So in other words, you would have an employee that would be an administrative law judge that would also be prosecuting or sitting as the judge in a prosecution brought by the Securities and Exchange Commission against individuals that they're claiming are violating some provision of one of these acts. Well, in this particular case that we're talking about here, the Supreme Court just recently ruled in a case called Jarkesy. The defendant's name in that was George Jarkesy. He was a hedge fund manager, and the Securities and Exchange Commission was alleging that Mr. Jarkesy violated provisions of one of the statutes that we previously talked about. And that they also went through this internal process and not through the federal court system where a jury would have adjudicated whether Mr. Jarkesy was in fact liable or not. Well, they chose to go through the internal process and they levied fines against Mr. Jarkesy in the amount of $300,000. Mr. Jarkesy appealed that. He claimed that the Seventh Amendment to the U.S. Constitution trumps the ability of the Securities and Exchange Commission to go through this internal process if they're going to come after him. He said that my constitutional rights are so important that I should be able to have a jury of my peers. And so that was the issue that was before the Supreme Court that basically the Supreme Court held. And this is their holding. They said when the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, seeks civil penalties against a defendant for securities fraud, like Jarkesy or any future potential defendant, the Seventh Amendment, the right to a jury trial of your peers, entitles the defendant to a jury trial. And they said these actions that the Securities and Exchange Commission bring against Mr. Jarkesy or other defendants similar to Mr. Jarkesy are similar to those claims of like fraud or common law fraud. And they said they're so similar in nature that the Seventh Amendment applies if the Securities and Exchange Commission was not involved. The Seventh Amendment applies to a defendant's right to a fair jury trial in a courtroom. Why wouldn't it apply here in the context of the Securities and Exchange Commission? And so if you see the holding, if you read the holding, you can see the rationale of the justices that ruled in the majority at the Supreme Court. And they said the right to a jury trial by jury is of such importance and occupies so firm a place in our history and jurisprudence that any seeming curtailment of this right has always been and should be scrutinized with the utmost care. That was from a prior decision, but the Supreme Court adopted that rationale associated with that. And so as a result, the Seventh Amendment now has essentially guaranteed that in suits of common law, the right of a jury trial shall be preserved. So they said, that's exactly what's happening here. So what's the importance, the impact associated with that? Well, if you are in the process, or if you're in the process of being essentially in an enforcement action that's being brought against you as a defendant, the Securities and Exchange Commission, you now have the right to go to a jury trial. And likewise, if you're one of our colleagues in the Securities and Exchange Commission and you're thinking about whether to bring an enforcement action against a defendant, now you realize that the Supreme Court has required you to not be able to go through that internal process through the administrative law judge process if you're going to seek civil penalties. And in fact, now you have to bring those enforcement actions into federal court before an Article 3 judge. An Article 3 judge is Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, where those judges, those federal judges, are actually appointed by U.S. presidents. So very significant, a very significant decision, very important for anyone that's in the process of actually selling securities. And that's our opinion here. Happy hunting, everybody. God bless.